As always, kindly muted while not speaking, and you can turn off your camera if you have low bandwidth, but we really encourage you to have your cameras open so that we can see each other. Please use the chat function to type in questions at any point throughout the session. When a presenter has finished, we also encourage you to raise your hands and ask your questions directly to the presenter as well. We will share the presentations after the session, and I hope everyone received their presentations from yesterday. If not, just send me an email. Next slide, please. Great. So I'll hand over to Tina, who will be taking us through today's check-in.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So good to see you. Welcome those back who we got to meet yesterday, and also welcome those who are only able to join today. And someone's asking, how can I open my camera? So that's a good question. So you should have a menu bar somewhere. Have a look and see if you have a menu bar. And then normally in the left-hand side, there's like a video, like a camera button. So perhaps give that a go. There's also the microphone. And like Bianca was saying, you know, we might be muting you just to keep the background noise down, but also we'll have lots of opportunities throughout the day where we're super keen to hear from you. And it's really nice to see you also. So we understand that it's absolutely an issue of bandwidth also, but if your camera does allow, it's so nice to actually be together in these virtual spaces and see each other. And yeah, we just wanted to do a quick little check-in and see how you are this morning. So Jutta, if you can go to the next slide. So the question is, who looks like how you feel today? And we invite you to choose an animal and share in the chat who looks like how you're feeling today. And why. We would like to know why. And that can be just in general. It could be regarding the upcoming COP or understanding corresponding adjustments. That's up to you. So let's have a look and see what we see. So Suri is saying 5. So we also want to know why. So I'm still a bit. See, that's the porcupine. Is the 5 is the porcupine? No? I never know the English word for it. Okay. Yeah. Good. Yay. Great. I think I'm number 6. I'm sort of awake, but I'm still feeling a bit sort of with crazy hair. All right. Good. People looking forward to what's happening today. Ah, so it's a nice morning, nice cool morning. Okay. And Winnie, where are you based? Where is it nice and cool this morning?
And you know what is so great with having the cameras open? I can see a lot of smiling faces. Just have a look at all the group if you're able to do. So maybe you can even enlarge the area to see where you can see each other. You know, there's sometimes you can slide, you can make the presentation a bit smaller and have a look at all the people. And I feel it's so beautiful that now we have maybe it's more than half of the people opening their cameras. And isn't that great to see each other? Yeah, Sherry, good morning. You know, exactly. And we said we are giving an extra good morning to those opening the camera.
Yeah, but we understand it's, yeah.
Yeah, and of course we understand that some people have technical issues. So, but you can also benefit from seeing all the other colleagues. And while looking at these funny creatures, I feel it's so good to see you all smiling, because that makes me smiling, and that makes a whole different feeling in my whole body, and that's really great. Thank you for that.
Okay, so people are enjoying the fresh morning in Uganda. Good. Okay, then I would say I hand over to Bianca for recapping what we did yesterday.
Great, thank you for that exercise. I hope everyone could relate to the different animals. So yeah, I know we're all smiling and waking up now. So thanks again for joining in. And I believe we have a colleague who's joined us from West Africa. Thank you so much. The time difference is a bit crazy, so we know it's been quite an effort. Welcome, Aliun. And so just a recap on yesterday's session, it will be around the two presentations we had. The first one from the UNFCCC, which was given by Amy Steen, which was an update on Article 6 and the focus around what corresponding adjustments mean. And it was, in a nutshell, it was defined, the rules for corresponding adjustments will be defined under Article 6 and Article 13 of Transparency Framework. And we've seen that there are a lot of priority issues for COP26. And this was, she shared three main topics around share of proceeds, avoiding double counting for outside NDCs, and use of CERs. So even within those top priorities, you can see there's somewhere where corresponding adjustments fits in. So it's a very important discussion. And just remind everybody that it has been decided that corresponding adjustments will be used. This was under the COP decision 21, CP 21, paragraph 36, which definitely states that they need to elaborate on how to do this to avoid double counting on the basis of corresponding adjustments. So these are really important for environmental integrity, for ensuring that once a party transfers their ITMOs, that they don't count it towards their NDC, but rather they can add it to their emissions balance, and then the receiving country will minus it from the balance. So like Amy said, it's on the principle of double entry. So it has to balance out on both sides and to clearly see where the ITMOs are moving from. We don't want them being disappearing or being used twice. Maybe if you can go back to the previous slide, I'm still on it. Yeah. The one just before, sorry, I don't know what's happened to the presentation. Do we have the presentation?
Peter, you're on mute. I think it's coming.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I can still continue, but just let me know when the slide comes back.
Yeah, it was my mistake. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Yes. So I was just explaining how she went into detail on how it's important for environmental integrity, how it will be done, has implications and understanding of different NDCs and the different collective emissions of parties. She touched very lightly on the methods, which we will go to in detail today during the exercise. And then after that, so that was from the Article 6 perspective, but we also had a detailed session that looked into the role of corresponding adjustment from the voluntary carbon markets. This has been quite important for the Eastern Africa portfolio because a lot of projects have actually been taking place in different sectors, mostly around cook stoves and REDD+. Those have been very important sectors for issuance for BCM. And we've seen that there are different types of certification standards that have been used. So it's Gold Standard, Verra, Plan Vivo, and all have a different percentage of the amount of projects registered and the amount of issuance. So based on these different standards, we saw that there are various use cases for offsetting, and some of them are using offsetting with corresponding adjustments such as Gold Standard, and others that are coming up with methods that don't necessarily use corresponding adjustments, where the ITMOs remain back in the country, and then it's not. The problem with offsetting without corresponding adjustment is that it could lead to double counting, but there's the presentation goes into the details of the different types of methods that are being used between the different standards. So in your countries, you need to really look at your portfolios and really understand what is required, what they are proposing, but also as a country, decide how you would want to be reporting on your corresponding adjustments. So how these activities will affect that. And we did a lot of questions around who will be authorizing and how this is going to look because this market is still growing. So as I said, there's implications for carbon market attractiveness and prices. The prices for VCM units has been going up, but it also depends on the scale, whether you're buying in bulk or whether you're buying a lot. It also depends on the sector. nature-based has been getting very high prices of late. So it's something that even if you're in government, you definitely need to understand what's going on, because there has been a lot of activity in it and it will continue. So role of the host country in terms of authorization is really important. And these discussions need to be had very early, and implementation needs to happen, and then very clear rules and procedures around ITMO transfers. So next slide, please. Thank you. Of course, the presentations are a lot more detailed, and we'll make the recordings available as well. So for today, we are on day 2, which is on the template for corresponding adjustments. So as we mentioned yesterday, this training is the response of a request from member countries to actually explain how we do this corresponding adjustments, or how it would look like. Of course, the rules are not decided yet, but we can put together based on the discussions that have been ongoing and developments that have been taking place. Next slide, please. So just to give an overview of today, so we're in the first part, which is the introduction, then we'll go into the presentation, which will be taken through by Sina, and she will take us through a draft template that will explain the concept of doing these calculations, or what is required. And then we'll have feedback and a short break, after which now we will go into group exercises. There will be 3 scenarios, and participants will be split into the different scenarios, but the information, the background, I sent it to you this morning in the emails, so we'll have time to go through that in detail. After that, we'll come back into the reporting stage and the plenary discussion, where issues that come up during the exercises can be brought to the plenary, and we can discuss as a group. And then we will close and prepare for tomorrow again. So with that, next slide, please. Great. So yeah, it's basically myself and Yuta and Tina who will be taking us through the sessions today. But the next slide, we will hand over now to Sina, who will take us through the template that has been prepared and will expound on the methods. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Sina now, and we can start. Great.
Thank you, Bianca, and good morning, everyone. Can everyone see the presentation on my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So just a quick presentation before we start. You might be asking yourself, I know all these guys from Perspectives for years now. They have been around for so long. Why do I not know Sina? That has a very simple reason. I'm usually not working so much on carbon markets, but I'm an expert on monitoring, reporting, and verification systems. So I, for example, recently helped Rwanda further develop their NDC tracking system. So I'm coming from another corner of the transparency community, and of course with corresponding adjustments, because the emission balance, which is fueled by our greenhouse gas inventory data, is so relevant. I've been brought into this project, and I find it really fascinating to bring these 2 worlds together, which generally lie quite a lot apart. So in this presentation, we're going to do 2 things. We're first going to look in a bit more detail into single year target approaches for corresponding adjustments. And once we understand that a little bit better, then we're going to look at this draft template for performing corresponding adjustments and tracking progress. And don't worry, I'll take you through everything in great detail, if technology allows. Here we go. So yesterday, we had a very helpful presentation from Amy, among other, talking about various approaches for applying corresponding adjustments. And she indicated that not all of them are fully elaborated yet. You know a specific target approach, which is the budget approach, already a little bit from the Kyoto Protocol. So under the Kyoto Protocol, we simply said, okay, we're setting a target for greenhouse gas inventory emissions in the time frame 2008 to 2012. So in order to track progress towards that target, we're just adding up emissions from all of these years, 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then we compare it with the overall target value that we have set. So that is a budget target. That is very, very simple to do. Now, with NDCs, we also have single year targets, and that's a bit more complicated if we want to apply corresponding adjustments and track progress. And under Article 2 draft guidance, at the moment, we have two approaches for applying corresponding adjustments to single year targets. That's on one hand, the averaging approach, and on the other hand, the trajectory approach. We're going to look into these with quantitative examples in just a minute. Before we do that, let me explain that actually we're talking about a two-step approach here when we apply the averaging and the trajectory approach. So first, we have to answer the question, how do we perform corresponding adjustments? So how do we calculate the numbers? But when we have performed corresponding adjustments, then we want to know what do we actually compare these new numbers to understand whether we are on track to achieving our NDC, and is this even possible for all of these approaches? And we're going to look into these two steps right now. So let's start with the averaging approach. With the averaging approach, we calculate a rolling average. What is that? So if we want to calculate the necessary corresponding adjustment that we need to make to our emission balance for a certain year, then we have to add up all the ITMO transfers that we have made up to that year, and then we divide it by the number of years which have passed since the start of the NDC period. Thanks for muting. Including the current year. And I find this very difficult to explain verbally, but it's very clear once you use numbers. So if we look at a very simple example of, sorry, losing my voice here, we have a number of ITMO transfers in an NDC period, which goes from 2021 to 2025. And we have a transfer of 2 in the first year, then 3 in the second and third year, and 2 again in the fourth and fifth year. Now, how can we calculate the corresponding adjustment which we need to make? In the first year, you can see we only have transferred 2 ITMOs so far, and it's the first year of the NDC. So we calculate 2 divided by 1, 2 ITMOs transferred divided by 1 year. And that, of course, leads us to a result of 2. Sorry, technical problems. For 2022, we sum up the transfers made in 2021 and 2022. So that's 5. And in 2022, it's the second year of the NDC. So we divide 5 by 2, and that gives us 2.5. In the third year, the cumulative ITMO transfers are 2 plus 3 plus 3, so that's 8, divided by 3, because it's the third year of the NDC implementation. So that brings us to 2.66666 indefinitely. And this way we can calculate the remaining corresponding adjustments that we need to make. So what does this mean now if we look at our emission balance? You can see again on this slide the number of ITMO transfers and the corresponding adjustments which we need to make. You are already familiar with these from the previous slide. You can additionally now see the emission balance, which is the greenhouse gas emissions minus the greenhouse gas removals from the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And you can see that there's a slight increasing trend here in total emissions. So we're starting with 10 tons CO2 equivalent in 2021 and finishing going up to 14 tons in 2025. Now, how can we calculate the adjusted emission balance? We simply add the corresponding adjustments that we need to make to the emission balance. So for 2021, the emission balance is 10. The corresponding adjustment we need to make is 2, so that provides us an adjusted emission balance value for 2021 of 12 tons. Same approach for the other years. So for example, for 2024, we have an emission balance of 13 tons. We have a corresponding adjustments that we need to make of 2.5. So that brings us to an adjusted emission balance of 15.5. Okay, how do we track progress now? In this specific case, we have a single year NDC target for the year 2025 of 16 ton CO2 equivalent. And now let's check. In 2025, we have an emission balance of 16.4 tons. So that is higher than 16 tons. So in this specific case, the country has not achieved its NDC target. It can, of course, acquire some ITMOs. It would not be a large amount in order to achieve the target.
Sina,
yeah.
Can I just ask you? There's one question in the chat. Maybe it's good to have a little break at that moment.
Of course.
The question is: kindly repeat. How do you calculate the greenhouse gas emissions balance?
Yes, happy to. So for the greenhouse gas emissions balance, you simply take your national greenhouse gas inventory and you make a total. So you already do this as part of your normal reporting under the UNFCCC. This means that you add up your greenhouse gas emissions, for example, from the energy sector, for example, from the industrial processes and other product use sector, from the waste sector, and so on. But you might also have emission removals, meaning that you integrate carbon into biomass, for example, in forests, for example, in soils, and that would happen in the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector. So in that sector, you might potentially have negative emissions, which we call removals, and we would just add up our emissions with our removals, and that would provide us with what we call the emission balance. Does that answer the question? I'm happy to explain more.
I think you can proceed. Yeah, okay. There's another remark in the chat. So the greenhouse gas EB equivalent to greenhouse gas emissions minus reductions. Is the greenhouse gas EB equivalent to greenhouse gas emissions minus reductions? Is the question.
It's important to distinguish in the greenhouse gas inventory world, we speak of removals. So that is the carbon that is incorporated into biomass. This is not immediately the same as reductions, which is what we speak about usually, for example, in the CDM world or in the voluntary carbon market world. But the concept is similar. So what we are interested in is basically the net emissions that occur in a country. So what we emit minus what we have incorporated into biomass.
Okay, I think you can proceed, Sina, and there's high appreciation in the chat for your explanations.
Great.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good. So before we go to the next slide, there is one very important point to make about this averaging approach. And that is that because we are calculating a rolling average, so transfers in every single year matter, it is quite difficult to track progress while you are still in the NDC period. So you can only really understand whether you have met your target or not after the NDC period, when you have your greenhouse gas inventory data and the transfers made for all years. So on one hand, it's a method which is quite simple to apply. Once you have wrapped your head around the calculation approach, but it requires that you have data for all years to really understand whether you have met the target or not. Now, with the trajectory approach, the concept is different. So here we start out by saying, this is my NDC target. It applies for a single year, but I actually want to provide myself with a bit more orientation for the other years of the NDC period as well. So we calculate what we call an NDC trajectory. And that NDC trajectory tells you what your emissions should maximum be in every single year of the NDC period. This raises a question that we're going to discuss later. Let's talk about the technicality first. So now calculating the adjusted balance is much easier in this case, because we don't have to calculate a rolling average to understand what corresponding adjustments we should make. The corresponding adjustments that we need today to make are simply the net ITMO transfers for every single year. And when I say net ITMO transfers, that means the transfers we make minus the acquisitions we make. In this specific example here, a country has only made transfers, so it does not need to make an additional calculation step. And in order to arrive at our adjusted emission balance, we just take the greenhouse gas emission balance. So again, our greenhouse gas emissions plus the removals from the national greenhouse gas inventory. And we combine that with the ITMO transfers. So very practically, again, for 2021, we have a greenhouse gas emission balance of 10 tons CO2 equivalent. The country has made ITMO transfers of 2 tons. So together we have an adjusted emission balance of 12 tons. Another example for 2024, we have a greenhouse gas emission balance of 13 tons. We have ITMO transfers of 2 tons. We add them up and we have an adjusted emission balance of 15 tons. Now, what does that mean for tracking progress? If we look into the draft Article 6.2 guidance as it stands now, it is not perfectly clear how we should track progress. So it is perfectly clear how we should calculate the adjusted emission balance, but it is not clear what we should compare that emission balance to in order to track progress and understand whether we have met our NDC target or not. So there's several options. One option is we compare the updated emission balance against the NDC trajectory in every single year. So if we go back here, in this case, we would compare in 2021 the value of the adjusted emission balance, which is 12, with the NDC trajectory value, which is also 12. So in this case, we are fine because the adjusted emission balance should not exceed the NDC trajectory value. However, we need to achieve this in every single year. And because there are things that are outside our control, for example, certain weather events or things like the global economy, this can be a little bit risky if we try to achieve the target every single year. Now, the second option would be using the trajectory to calculate a budget approach. And this would basically be the same thing that we did under the Kyoto Protocol, that we calculate a total amount in our specific case that we have to achieve between 2021 and 2025. So we add up all the trajectory emissions, and this is basically our emission budget that we should not exceed. And then at the end of the year, at the end of the period, we calculate our total adjusted emissions and we compare it with our emission budget. And then if we are a little bit over in some year and a little bit under in other years, that is not a problem at all because we're looking at the period as a whole. Let's see what this means then in practice. So we are again working with the same data. We have an NDC trajectory from 2021 to 2025, which considers that the country is still developing, is still growing its economy. So emissions will increase a little bit over time. And we have an adjusted emission balance with the trajectory method of 12, 14, 15, 50, and 16 tons over the NDC period. And this leads us to a greenhouse gas emission surplus or gap if we compare the NDC trajectory value and the adjusted emissions balance. So we already saw that in 2021, the values are the same. So there is no surplus, no gap. We are fine. However, in 2022 and in 2023, the adjusted emissions balance is higher than the NDC trajectory. So if we have chosen an option where we have to comply with the NDC trajectory value every single year, this would mean that the NDC target is not achieved. Because for 3 years, we are fine. We do not exceed the NDC trajectory value, but for 2 years, we do not meet this value. Now, yeah,
maybe we can have a little break here.
of course.
Just because there is some conversation going on in the chat, and there was the question, what is the use of the adjusted emissions balance? And Stefan Hoch already explained it a bit, but maybe we just, if you don't mind, just to have a little break to ask if there's any clarification questions for the moment for all of you listening, that you might need to further just continue with listening and understanding the whole process. And I know there will be the exercise later, but just giving the floor. If you have any questions now, you can also raise your hand and we can hear you. This is just maybe, yeah. So it's Ressa. Ressa has raised her hand. I think it's a she, sorry, I hope at least. Maybe so, Ressa, just speak up. Ask your question now.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to just go through unpacking for us the options that we have under 6.2 on calculating the CAs. And my question is, this is really mind-boggling for me right now. I'm trying to picture in the baseline for Kenya right now, and this is really good news to hear now. But I'm asking myself, how is it applicable now between the NDC we submitted, keeping in mind the decision to be made in Glasgow, if it will be made, and in the next submission of the NDC, that is in 2025 or 2026. And the second question is this approach, are you showing us from which perspective are we calculating from? Is it from the acquiring party or from the selling party? That's all I have. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ressa. Yeah, and also you're very open, maybe all the other colleagues from the team, to also help Sina in answering these questions, because it's big questions. But Sina, go ahead. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and thanks to Ressa, because I think these are questions which are probably worrying everyone at the moment. So in her presentation yesterday, Amy already raised this point that the fact that the Article 6.2 guidance is not finalized, and it's not clear how, for example, these single year methodologies should be applied in detail. This is indeed a huge problem, considering that countries are now submitting or already have submitted their updated NDC, not being able to understand what the options are, and thus not being able to decide for an option. So I'm inviting Stefan to comment on this point after me. My understanding is that for the moment, it is not possible for countries to make a decision because the alternatives have not been agreed. So the only option is to stay open here and take a risk-based approach and say, okay, I'd rather be a bit more cautious with ITMO transfers because I cannot be sure at this point how I will account for them in detail. But maybe Stefan, you could add, or Aglaya if she is on the call.
Yeah. No, I can add, thank you very much, Sina, and also thank you to the participants for these good questions. I think they're pertinent. And as you said already, Sina, I think the crunch issue here is that the two methodologies that we present here, that Sina has presented, are the current state of the discussions in the UNFCCC negotiations. So these two methodologies and no other ones are being discussed by parties. But since they are not finalized, the negotiations, it could still change somehow, so that's why we are trying to convey the best possible understanding one can have of these methodologies at the moment, noting that they're not the final agreed set of methodologies, and we really need to wait for Glasgow to be able to give a definite recommendation on how to implement it. But we are also now here presenting not the the final way of doing this, but a simplified version that illustrates, what the meaning is of these methodologies. And I do think in their basic form, they're unlikely to change. And so therefore, I think it's important now to look at this exercise as a way of improving the understandings of what are the mechanics of the calculation in a way, because that is more or less, I would say, almost independent of the methodology that is here in this slide that we currently see, to see this adjusted emissions balance, whether it's the trajectory method or the averaging method, that could change, but we will have a value there. And what kind of addition and subtractions do we need to make? I mean, that already stands more or less, I think. And the final point I wanted to make also, in addition, what hasn't come up yet, I think it sounds very scary to see something that the NDC target may not have been met after a corresponding adjustment. And here we are also dealing with a little bit of uncertainty of what the implication of the corresponding adjustment is, because all of the countries in the region have both conditional and unconditional targets. We didn't want to show this distinction here because it would just make the table more complex and therefore more difficult to understand. But it's clear that the conditional NDC targets are contingent on international support, including from markets, and therefore you can still reach your NDC target after the conditional NDC target, after making a corresponding adjustment. And in particular, the unconditional NDC target may not have been met, if you transfer even more than what was in the conditional target. But we intentionally left that out because it would really make, the understanding of these calculations more difficult. But I just wanted to throw that in, to qualify, the impression that perhaps, the NDC target cannot be met after doing corresponding adjustment. And what I just said is also still not finalized, of course, between parties, which is, making this whole discussion difficult, but it is the best possible understanding that we have right now, and it is also something that we will pick up again in the negotiation workshops. And final remark, you can also read up on these issues in the negotiations handbook that you already find on the website of the East African Alliance, where there is a relatively detailed explanations also with additional graphs and so on, of these two different methods. So you can read up on these issues also in this form. Sorry for taking a bit long.
Oh, I think it's very good. Thank you, Stefan. And Axel, go ahead if you have any more remarks, because your hand is also up.
Yeah, thank you. So I see a number of questions, specific questions in the chat. First to Rachel. So of course, an ITMO is about an emission reduction, but the corresponding adjustment means that emission reduction is subtracted from the host countries, from the transferring countries' balance. And that's why it comes into emission terms. So it's like double bookkeeping, and therefore the emission reduction becomes an addition to the emissions balance of the selling country. That's crucial because, this double bookkeeping principle is actually the key aspect. Then there is the question from Isa. So as Stefan said, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So you may come into the negotiation and say, all this is rubbish, we want a different approach. But then, of course, you might face a lot of countries who think that this is very important. So I would think among the issues, the crunch issues that have been mentioned by Amy on the first day, this is one of the less contested ones. What may still, of course, be the question is whether corresponding adjustment could be waived for the least developed countries. That has been a proposal. So, of course, we need to see how the negotiations deal with this proposal. But overall, it is seen by almost all parties that environmental integrity of the Article 6 strongly depends on the corresponding adjustment. And then...
Sorry, Axel. Can I suggest, because we only have 2 more slides left in this. I think it will be better for the general understanding if we do these 2 more slides and then we go into the remaining questions, and I'm sure there will be additional questions, because otherwise what happens now is that we're going into a Q&A round halfway through. But thanks a lot, because all of these questions clearly need to be addressed.
Welcome. Please continue.
Thank you. So I know that that Ressa had a second question. I would say, if it's okay, let's also park this for now. Now that we have clarified anything that wasn't immediately clear, and compare the 2 approaches, or let's say the 2.5 approaches, because this will lead to additional questions. And I think it's easier to clarify all together then. So this was, there is someone with their mic open, could you mute? Thank you, great. So this was the first option. So this was the trajectory. This was the first option, the trajectory approach, if we compare values in every single year. Now we have another option, and that would be that we look at the budget approach. So we have a cumulative consideration, and how do we calculate that? So we just add up the GHG emission surplus or gap for each single year. So for each single year, we calculate the difference between the adjusted emission balance and the NDC trajectory and add it up. So that it means in 2021, oops, this should not, in 2021, the difference is 0. So the cumulative value is also 0 because there's no other years yet. In 2022, we're adding up the difference for 2021 and 2022, which is 0 plus 1. So we have 1. In 2023, we add up the difference for 21, 22, and 23. So that's 0 plus 1 plus 1, which is 2. And I realize that there is an error here. Can someone tell me why? Can someone tell me what value there should be in 2024 if I had paid attention?
Should be 2.
Yes, exactly, Rose. Thanks a lot. Because what we would do is simply add up the values for 2021 to 2024. So that's 0 plus 1 plus 1 plus 0. So there should be 2 in this. And I'll of course update this before the presentation is shared with you. So if we look at 2025, the cumulative value is 2, which means that as at a cumulative perspective, our adjusted GHG emissions over the whole period are 2 tons higher than our NDC budget. So the values for the trajectory, we could also have calculated this by adding up all of this first row and then comparing it to the value we gain by adding up all of this second row. So this means in the end that again, our emissions are too high. So, oops, sorry. So also under the budget, we are not meeting the NDC target, neither with the annual approach nor with the cumulative, the budget approach, we're meeting the NDC target in this specific case. And as Stefan said, the idea is not to make you learn that you shouldn't do corresponding adjustments because that will not make you achieve your NDC target. What we're trying to tell you is that you have to watch your emissions and the adjusted emission balance very carefully and compare it either to your NDC trajectory or to your NDC budget. And you can see that in this case, the values are already very close over the various years. So this is a situation where ahead of time, before the end of the period, you can already see, okay, it's quite close. So I need to be maybe a bit cautious with either additional transfers, or I just need to reduce more in the time I have, which is of course not always that easy. So let's compare the three approaches. So the averaging approach, the trajectory approach looking at each single year, and the trajectory approach leading to a budget. We're always using the same NDC target, which is a single year target of 16 tons CO2 equivalent for 2025. We're always using the same ITMO transfers, and we're always using the same greenhouse gas inventory data, which leads us to the same greenhouse gas emission balance. So if we look at the adjusted emission balances, the first thing you note is that they are different for the trajectory approach and the averaging approach. This is simply because when we calculate the adjusted emission balance for the averaging approach, we're applying corresponding adjustments not to the level or to the amount of net transfers made, but we calculate a rolling average of net transfers made. Whereas with the trajectory approach, we simply use the net transfers to make the corresponding adjustment. So this is one thing to keep in mind. The trajectory approach and the averaging approach lead to different adjusted emission balance values. Now, if we look at achieving the target, we already said for the averaging approach, we're slightly above the target. So we would need to additionally acquire some ITMOs or part of an ITMO. With regards to the trajectory approach, considering annual emissions, we also said that for 22 and 23, the adjusted emission balance is above the trajectory value. So we're also not achieving the target. And we said that for the cumulative approach, we're also not achieving the target because we are slightly above our overall emission budget. So what you can see is that each approach leads to different values. And had we used a different data set, we could potentially even have generated a situation where, for example, if we compare the trajectory approach with the annual values and the trajectory approach with the cumulative values, we could achieve the target under the cumulative approach, but not under the annual approach. For example, because under the annual approach, we don't achieve the targets in some years, but this is outweighed in other years. So as a total, we achieve the budget, but we're not compliant for every single year. And what does this tell us? It tells us that we need to be very, very cautious about the approach that we want to choose, and also about the position that we take in the negotiations. So clearly, a cumulative approach, if we're going for the trajectory method, seems more beneficial to countries because it gives more flexibilities. And also, the averaging approach has the drawback that we can only understand whether we're on track, whether we have achieved the target after the NDC period. On the other hand, with the trajectory approaches, we first need to create a trajectory. So the trajectory does not exist yet. So of course we have a target, but there at the moment there is no guidance how to generate the trajectory. So for example, what should the starting point of the trajectory be? What should it relate to? Should it be the net emissions of a certain year, for example? Should it be something else? We don't know. So with the trajectory approach, we have the drawback that we first need to generate a trajectory. And you can imagine this can be a very complex political process to agree on such values. So thank you for your attention so far. We are not done with the presentation. We're still going into the template, but I can imagine that there will be a lot of questions in the chat by now. So let's take a few minutes for any clarifications on what we've seen before.
So Sina, I think there is no more question coming up for the moment, but for those who haven't been able to raise their questions, you can just give it verbally as well. Let's take 2 or 3 minutes because I think you can proceed to the table. It looks like there's no, or do you?
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually there was Resa's second question.
Yes.
that we had parked. Resa, could you maybe repeat your second question to everyone?
Okay, I wanted to get both views in terms of the acquiring party, the ITMO acquiring party, and then the ITMO selling party, but now I've gotten the picture.
Okay, good. So just to clarify, what we see here is the view of the selling party, because we tried to take the perspective that we think is most likely for the EAA members. It would, of course, have been interesting to also look at the other side. However, this exceeded the time that we had. Now, I also asked Axel to wait a moment and stopped him in answering another question. And I think he was just commenting on whether methodologies are presented, are already accepted by parties, or are still under negotiation. And indeed, as Stefan also said, at the moment we have the Article 6.2 guidance, which mentions the averaging approach and which mentions the trajectory and corresponding adjustments should be made. But it does not explain for the trajectory approach how the tracking progress part should work. So what do we compare the emissions balance to? Do we compare it to the values of the NDC trajectory for every single year, or do we compare it to a budget? So these things can still change. And as Stefan also said, and Axel said, in principle, everything could unravel completely and we end up with very, very different methodologies. But from experience, I think we can say it's likely that it's going to be these methodologies, but we cannot yet be 100% sure how the detailed guidance will evolve. So for example, what to compare the the adjusted emissions balance to for the trajectory approach. Just going through the other questions.
Sina, there's Nagla who's raising her hand. Maybe we listen to what Nagla says or want to comment on.
Yes, Nagla, please.
Okay, good morning all. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's very clearly. Maybe one point for what relationship between the NDC trajectory and GHG emission balance. The GHG emission balance before the NDC and after the GHG report, national report here in different country.
So I just to make sure I fully understand your question, because the line was a little bit bad. So you wanted to understand better what is the difference between the NDC trajectory and the greenhouse gas emissions balance. Is that right?
Yeah, yes.
Mm-hmm. Let me explain. So we start with the NDC trajectory. If we have a single year target, then countries have often simply said by 2030 or by 2025, our greenhouse gas emissions will not be higher than a specific level. And there's different ways of identifying or specifying that different level. So it can be a comparison to a business as usual, for example, or it can be a comparison to a reference year, for example, emissions in 2010. Now, because we only know that single year and we want to have a bit more guidance for the trajectory method, it is required that the country does not only say, this should be my emissions in the target year, but this should be my emissions in all the years before. So basically the country has to define like an interim emission target. In this specific case, where we have an NDC period for 2021 to 2025, we need a kind of guiding value for 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, and 2025. What we don't know yet in detail is how to calculate this value. So there is really no guidance on this. So you could maybe calculate it by comparing with the latest greenhouse gas inventory data you have. So for example, you could say this country has greenhouse gas inventory data for 2016, and it has just compared this value with the value in 2025 and then generated a line. So simply calculated how would my emissions have to develop. So I go from the 2016 value to the 2025 value. That would be one option. So the idea of the NDC trajectory is that it gives you an orientation how the values should develop over time so you can reach your NDC target. Now, the greenhouse gas emissions balance is what happens in real life. So in order to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions balance, you prepare your national greenhouse gas inventory, meaning your greenhouse gas emissions and your greenhouse gas removals, and you calculate a net. So you calculate what you have emitted and you calculate what you have stocked in biomass and in soils. And this tells you what has really happened with regards to GHG emissions in the country. So you could say that the NDC trajectory is how we want emissions to develop. And the GHG emission balance is how emissions have really developed. And then we can compare the two. Has that answered the question?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Very, very welcome.
Yeah, just an information about the time. We do have 8 minutes left till the break, and we have another question in the chat. And I'm not sure how many slides you want to present before we go to the break. So
yes,
maybe I suggest you continue with your presentation, the table. I think you're going to present us the table that is being used in the exercise later. And then we have another question from Derek, and we will come back to this question before the break. But maybe you just first finish your presentation.
Yeah, actually, I think this question I can answer very quickly
Oh,
and
okay.
then
Thanks.
and
Yeah.
then finish the presentation. So the question from Derek was whether we can present results of both approaches in the biannual update report or the biannual transparency report. And the answer is, of course, we can do that. So actually, it could be a very nice way to be more transparent, to present results from various approaches. However, it's important to keep in mind that the country has to commit itself to one of the approaches. Once they have been agreed in the negotiation, each country has to say, I am going to use this approach. And this approach then provides you with the value that you're going to be held accountable for. So yes, you can provide all the values, but only one set of values will be considered in the end after your NDC period has finished. So, and now we quickly go through the template, which is not complicated at all. So as part of this project, we have developed a draft table for corresponding adjustments. And the idea of this draft table is really just to help you understand what data do I need to collect, how can I calculate the corresponding adjustments, and how can I track progress. We have developed templates separately. So there is one for the trajectory approach and one for the averaging approach. We could also have one for the budget approach. This could be adjusted in a very simple manner, but here we're only going to look at the trajectory and the averaging approach. Please keep in mind, this is really just a very first draft. The idea is that we can discuss it with you and get your input, because you would be the users of this template. So the more feedback we get, and that can be today or that can be tomorrow, the better. But the table can really only be finalized after all the decisions have been made at COP. So here I'm showing you the template for the trajectory method. You can see that there's basically two parts of it. In the upper part, we have a list of transfers and acquisitions, and we're going to look into that in more detail in a moment. And at the bottom, we have all the elements that we need to make the calculation that you have just seen in the exercise. So information about the annual greenhouse gas emission balance, information about the annual greenhouse gas emission balance under the NDC scope, because a number of countries have not included all sectors and all gases in their NDC. So the greenhouse gas emissions under the NDC scope will be lower than the total national greenhouse gas emissions. Then we have the net annual ITMO transfers. We have the linear NDC trajectory. We have the adjusted emission balance that we have just calculated together. And we have the greenhouse gas emissions surplus or gap that we also just calculated together. I'm going to show you this in a little bit more detail. I'm just going to also show the template for the averaging method now. And you can see that the principle is the same. So it's a table that is split into two parts. In the upper part, we have the transfers and acquisitions. And in the lower part, we have basically the data and the calculation steps. And of course, for the averaging method, things are a little bit different. So again, we have the annual greenhouse gas emission balance, which is economy-wide. So this is simply what you would report under your national greenhouse gas inventory. And then we have the annual greenhouse gas emissions under the NDC scope, which might be smaller if you have not included all sectors and all gases. Then we have the net annual ITMO transfers, which is simply the sum of all transfers minus all acquisitions. So you can simply calculate this by taking the values here in the table. And then we calculate the annual average ITMO transfers. This is calculated in a bit of a complicated manner. You remember how we calculated the rolling averages. And then finally, we have the adjusted emission balance, which is simply the annual greenhouse gas emission balance under the NDC scope, plus the annual average ITMO transfers, exactly also the calculation that we did. And we're now going to look into the table in a little bit more detail, just to make it clearer. So if we look at the upper part, simply the list of transfers and acquisitions, at the moment, we have some informational items. For example, there will be some kind of ITMO ID, an ID as we also have it for CDM certificates at the moment. And of course, we don't want to look at individual ITMOs of 1 ton. We want to look at whole transfers. So this could be packages of ITMO IDs, or this could be a reference to a list with the ITMO IDs which fall under this transfer. The unit that we're going to use are tons CO2 equivalent. And then we have some cells for further information on the type of transfer of acquisition. So the first is authorization purpose. And that could be, for example, that it's a transfer under Article 6.2 or under Article 6.4. It could be also other mitigation purposes. So for example, a transfer for CORSIA or for IMO, or it could be a transfer or acquisition for other purposes, so on the voluntary market. Then we have action type, just to distinguish what this is. So is it a first transfer? Is it an acquisition? Is it use of an ITMO? Is it cancellation? And so on. And there is one point which is very important, and that is whether a corresponding adjustment is required or not. It might not be required in all cases. So for example, we have heard yesterday that for certain standards on the voluntary markets, for example, with Verra, a corresponding adjustment is not required. So it's really important to fill this out carefully to avoid any misjudgments later when you're tracking progress.
Sina, just to give information, it's running short for time to have a break soon. So maybe you can, I don't know if there's any more.
I will speed up. I think we, so basically you are already familiar with all the other items that we have in the table. Because we used them during the calculations just now. So I don't need to present them in a lot of detail. You have this table in the handout document that Bianca circulated yesterday, so you can take a look there as well. And we're going to provide you with updated handouts for the upcoming exercise, because we have changed just a few little things, but the table is the same. So if you want to take a look during the break, you can just go to the meeting invitation for today and find the table there. So, I would say, could we take 1 minute to just address any questions for clarification before we go into break?
Yes, Sina, there is a question from Rachel, and she asked, how do we differentiate between the conditional and unconditional NDC target at all along that process? conditional and unconditional NDC
Yes.
target?
Yes,
Maybe
so- yeah.
let me just come in here.
Yes, please.
Because there is no formal definition of what is conditional, unconditional under the UNSC Paris Agreement process. So this is a wide open flank, and we need to say we don't know. So of course, ideally, a well-organized country would have two calculations, one for the conditional and one for the unconditional part. But yeah, so far there is no regulation foreseen under the text, at least, because yeah, the text doesn't speak about conditional and unconditional. So we need to see how the interpretation of this evolves and whether the work program on Article 6 might address such issues. But I think it would be important to bring it into the negotiations because, yeah, it's an elephant in the room.
Thank you very much, Axel. And
Can I, sorry, Jutta, to interrupt. Can I just very briefly add on this? Very
of course,
briefly?
go for it. Yes.
Because I want to share, and I will post the link in the Skype chat, but because this is an important issue, we actually prepared a short study on that in cooperation with Mbai as the AGN lead coordinator that you can find on our Climate Finance Innovators website that specifically looks at how this issue has been addressed in the African NDCs as they were available, and we discussed some of the issues there. So I'll post the link in the Skype chat. It's not on the EAA website, but on our Climate Finance Innovators website. And this also gives you some background on this topic of conditionality as an additional resource. Thank you.
Stefan, I can't find it in the chat. Maybe you post it.
Yeah, I will put it now. Just
Okay, thank you.
Make my remark
great.
first, and then I'll post it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Yes.
Okay, good. And sorry, I lost the presentation for a moment now, but it's back up. Before we go into the break, let me very quickly introduce you to the exercise. So after the break, we will come back, and then you will be divided into groups. This will happen magically as it happened yesterday. And each group receives an exercise handout, and that handout is just 2 pages with some exercise instructions, which you have here as well, and a country scenario. And the handout basically asks you to help this country fill its NDC corresponding adjustment template and understand whether it is on track to meet its target or whether it has met his target. So we have 45 minutes for the exercise. So once you are in the group and have received the handout, which you will through the chat, so the facilitator in your group will post the handout through the chat. Please take 5 minutes to read it and ask any questions in the group. Then please discuss the tasks in your group. So discuss how you can fill the table, and the facilitator will have the table open in an Excel file. So it's easy to do all the calculation, and the participants will suggest to the facilitator what to do in the table. And then before coming back to the plenary, which will again happen magically, please discuss what are the 1 or 2 key insights or questions you are taking from this exercise, and then present it very briefly, just 1 minute per group. And we will note these insights and questions, and there will be more time later today and then particularly tomorrow to clarify and discuss these. Jutta, over to you. And thanks very much for everyone's attention and for all the good questions.
And thank you so much for doing all this work and putting all this stuff together and presenting it to us in that way. We really need a little break now because there was a lot of information. Thank you for everyone also co-creating the chat. So I invite you to have a little break, and it will be until 10:30. So we start a little bit later to the exercise. but I think it's good to have some fresh air in your room. And we highly recommend you to get up and just move around a bit and don't look at your emails now. Take a real break so that your brain can refresh for the upcoming exercise. And I will share some music with you so that you can be a bit more relaxed and really try to take a break. We are having these ongoing calls during the whole day, so we really invite you to take a break for yourself and enjoy the music, maybe if you want to. And I don't have to share this. So see you in 7 minutes. Oh, hello back, everyone. Nice to see you again. We now want you to have a very short wrap up of maybe 1 or 2 main thoughts you're coming with from the different groups. And we start with group 1 that was led by Stefan. So maybe Stefan, if you would just share 1 or 2 thoughts with us and give us a feedback. You have 1 minute. It's not very long, and we will indicate when the 1 minute is over. Tina will give you a sign. Here you go, Stefan.
I'll delegate this privilege to Gloria, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan, and thanks, everyone. So in our group, maybe we are not going to show the Excel sheet, but we realized that in the calculations, there are scenarios where the country has been able to meet its NDC targets with a sale of the mitigation outcomes, but also cases where there is a surplus. And we also are looking at how countries can really be able to meet their targets in scenarios where they have been able to sell more mitigation outcomes. And we also discussed that some of these issues will really be pertinent during the negotiations if countries can be able to have maybe some of the mitigation outcomes out of their NDCs, outside the scope of their NDCs, but this has to be really agreed upon. But also what we realized is that the exercise was very, very useful and it was very clear. But for scenarios, for instance, where we had up to the NDC was up to 2026, since we didn't have data on the greenhouse gas inventory for the 2 years, the 2025, 2026, it was a limitation. We could not have the calculations done. So I think one of the lessons here is also to ensure that countries are able to update their GEC inventories more regularly, and they're able to ensure that the projections are also very clear, because one of the issues that came out also clearly was the linear trajectory for all the years is not very clear, because countries have like specific targets. Say by 2030 they have one target, say by 2030 to reduce emissions up to a certain extent, say X, but the linear trajectory for all the years cannot be easily calculated because countries have not specified yearly targets. And I think that's also one of the limitations that we saw through, but maybe this is something that needs to be also discussed during negotiations. Yeah, but overall, I think it was a very good exercise, very insightful, and we're able to understand all the calculations. Maybe Mbaye has something to add before.
Yes, Mbaye. So yeah, if you can just be brief, if you want to add something from your perspective, Mbaye. Ready to listen to you. Just open your microphone. Maybe he's not with us. I can't see him.
No, he's still with us. Mbaye, you're muted still.
I'm with you. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Just to add something that one thing which is very important and is still under negotiation is the ITMO's transfer outside countries NDC. That is very important because some are pushing for having no corresponding adjustment for this ITMO transfer, while some others are pushing for having the corresponding adjustment because we want to avoid perverse incentives. And for countries to exclude potential sectors from potential sectors where they can buy a lot of, they can sell a lot of ITMOs to be excluded in their NDC. So we are still discussing that issue, but we need to finalize it under the Article 6. One other important issue is how we can avoid the other selling of ITMOs. We have, in the negotiation, decided to have an annual report. As you see in the table, every year the country has to submit a report and made it public, so everyone will know the situation in which the country is, whether this country has achieved its target or not, before buying from that country. That can be something that can avoid this other selling. But we think that it's not enough. We need also to put on place additional safeguards to avoid other selling. Because at the end of the day, at the end of the NDC period, we'll just see what happened. And if a country have other sell, we can't correct that situation. We are in a situation just under the transparency framework. We just see what happened for that country. What will be the measure to be taken to solve that issue? That are some technical issues that also needed to be addressed. But lastly, it's in relation to the transformation of countries NDC with single year target into this linear trajectory or a real trajectory or having the averaging. That is also something countries need at the early beginning to work on and to know what will be the situation that will be applied within a specific country. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mbaye, for this special perspective that is, I think, important for all of you. I would like to go back to the group 2, which was led by Sina and Sherry. So, and just remind you that we said like 1 minute, maybe you can like give your feedback in 1 minute so that we have time to hear from all the groups. So Sina, open your microphone.
Thanks. So we had a good group discussion, and that's why after I made my points very briefly, I would like everyone to add if you know they feel that some detail was lacking. So we worked with the averaging approach, and we realized that because in our scenario, the country is in the year 2026, it cannot track progress with the information it has. In order to track progress, at least indicatively, it would need greenhouse gas emission projections. So we discussed that it would be good to have another row in the table where the country can add its greenhouse gas emission projections under the NDC scope. We also discussed that at the moment we have information about the economy-wide emission balance and the emission balance under the NDC scope. And this can be a bit confusing. So the suggestion was to only include the emission balance under the NDC scope. Another point we saw that, which was already raised, is that indeed information is not always available up to the year you are in. So we saw that the transfers were available until 2025, the greenhouse gas inventory data, so the emission balance only up to 2024. So we were not able to calculate the emission balance even for 2025 or 2026, and obviously also not for the later years. I think that's the key points, and I would like to ask everyone in my group whether there's any points they would like to add in the seconds that remain.
So maybe we go to group 3, and at the end we might have 2 or 3 minutes to add up from everyone. So group 3 was led by Suri and Bianca. We're looking forward to your very brief feedback here.
Yeah, thanks, Jutta. We'll hand over to George, who will do the reporting for group 3. Yeah.
So thank you, Bianca. Group 3 had 8 members, and we basically went into looking at the assignment that were given. But there are some few issues that came up before we arrived at the values. One of them was we did a clarification around what came out as row number 3, the difference between the trajectory and the economy-wise basically emissions level. Then out of that, now we agreed that for you to get the adjusted value, you have to look at what that particular country had transacted in terms of the ITMOs internally and externally. Then as we progress now to the lower part of the calculation, row number 4 and number 5 brought a little bit of a discussion because we had to look at whether it came actually a discussion around issues to do with commitments, target, and then the reason why row number 1 is not being used. But after that discussion, the members felt they had an understanding that the target was more or less like the NDC trajectory, and it is used for good accounting purposes. Then out of that, now we went to the real calculation as guided into what could be presented in row number 6. And also there were discussion as to what a positive value means and what a negative value means. And what we concluded was, in the event that you have a sum that is negative, then it means the country has been able to trade basically and be able to operate far beyond their targets. So a positive value means the country is not doing so well in terms of meeting its NDC target. So those were the issues that we discussed and came up. If I missed something, maybe the other members could add up.
Thank you, George. So we might first hear group number 4, or at least it's Axel's group. It's scenario 1 again. So maybe Axel, you can give us a 1-minute brief feedback. Watching the time that it is like we have about 3 minutes left for the whole.
Well, Jutta, as I wrote to you in the chat, the rapporteur of our group is Issa Musa from Tanzania. So Issa should take the input. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Issa, you have the floor.
Issa, can you hear us? Maybe you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, yes. Hello, you hear?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, our reflection does not differ much with the previous groups, but the key message is that before we embark into these calculations of the templates of each item, we need to understand, for instance, if one, for instance, to get the unit for greenhouse gas emission surplus or gap, we need to take the linear NDC trajectory minus the adjusted emission balance. Those terminologies they need to be understood theoretically before you apply them into the template. The other thing is that our template has got inventory data which we are missing. For instance, in 2026, this shows that we need to do a robust inventory for countries to ensure that we do our inventory or emissions by segment or whatever, so they can have data which we support our calculation in terms of corresponding adjustments. Therefore, there are some results in our calculation. For instance, we got some positive and negative results in our group, we say that for those countries which they depend support from external countries to reach their target, if they not be supported, it will be a very challenging for them to reach their NDC target. Therefore, we need to ensure that we support those countries which is a conditional NDC. Even those who they have one conditional NDC, they should ensure that they pursue their NDC target, ensure that they participate well in the negotiations. Otherwise, if there are some other clarifications, Alex and my colleague may add more. Thank you.
So thank you for everybody sharing their insights with us at this last minutes of our today's training. So I just want to open the floor, and if you just give us 5 or 6 more minutes, we highly appreciate, because just to open the floor to everyone, if there's any remark you want to share now before we come to the wrap up and to the outlook for tomorrow, you're very welcome to do now. And you can also write it into the chat. Some people were already giving their remarks. So Mbaye first, and let's try to be really crisp because people are already leaving as their time is over. So Mbaye, please.
Very short.
Yes.
Just to put on the table some questions we need to think about and address later is the issue of conditional versus non-unconditional NDCs. When applying the corresponding adjustment in most countries that have conditional and unconditional, the selling of ITMOs is addressed under the conditional one. And under the transparency framework, we have not yet very clear separation on the reporting when it comes to the conditional and unconditional NDC. And also for some countries that don't have this conditional and unconditional, they have just an NDC, the application of the corresponding adjustment, whether it will be outside or in some aspect that are conditional, will apply in the unconditional one. We need to reflect on that issue and the implication of having both conditional and unconditional, as well as countries that have only one NDC without specifying the conditional or unconditional one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mbaye. Any more comments, questions, remarks, anything that should be shared now? Floor is still open for another minute before we close. So, yeah, there's some discussion going on in the chat. Maybe you want to share. Yeah, Ngala. Oh, sorry, Nagla.
Okay, thank you. Okay, no problem. Thank you very much. It's very important discussion here in this template. Maybe we need to be more clarification in different rows here in this table. Maybe to be they implemented after this workshop. Very important to be discussion here in how to be calculate these rows and finally to the result, and specifically the 6 the negative or positive this result maybe to be a different country to be negative or positive to be committed here in this rows. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nagla. Yes, and everybody will get the PowerPoints and all the exercises you already had, but you will be sent all this after the training today and tomorrow. So I would like, as I know that schedules are tight, I would like to come to an end for today and maybe just give the floor to Bianca. You wanted to give a little closing remarks and some ideas about tomorrow. Yes, here you are.
Yes, so just in summary, tomorrow we'll just open up with a bit of discussion still on the template. We'll probably unpack some of the comments we've been getting in the chat. There's definitely a lot that's been coming out. So we'll spend a bit of time on that, and then we'll go into a practical case study that will be demonstrated by El Hadji Mbaye, which will be from Senegal. And yes, so tomorrow is still around the practicalities of these different methods that are being used, but also a real scenario, and then our views reflecting on your own countries as well, how this can all be applied. Yeah, so very straightforward tomorrow.
Yeah, so thank you. And I will just stop the